there's a huge controversy amongst modern Muslims about the expansion of the Khilafah. And a lot of times what we have been taught or have heard people say is that these expansions were defensive in nature. That these expansions were defensive. That the Sharia does not allow an offensive war. This is the claim that is given. And this is a claim that is simply false and incorrect. And we do ourselves a disservice by pretending otherwise. By now, all of you are familiar with the fact that I don't beat around the bush and I'm not an apologetic. I call a spade, and I believe honesty is the best policy. The claim that there's no such thing as offensive jihad, and that the Muslims of early Islam never engaged in conquests, is a claim that is simply not backed up by any shred of evidence. In fact, the opposite is true. And that is an undeniable fact, which is why nobody pre-modernity ever said this. This is a very modern notion that is now being back projected onto early Islam. Now, the other side of the coin, which is the people who don't like us, they say, you guys spread Islam by the sword. And that's the other extreme. So, in the next 20 minutes, inshallah, we'll kind of give you the middle. What is the truth of the matter? Was Islam spread by the sword? Or is it all defensive and lovey-dovey and whatnot? What is the real, we had to fight. That's why I went and fought. What is the reality? Well, the fact of the matter is that in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, we can say, without being apologetic at all, that pretty much most of the battles were battles that were defensive in nature. That's very clear. You don't have to be an apologetic at all. Look at the situation. Who was persecuting whom? Who kicked whom out of their lands? Who was the one? So it's very clear that Badr and Uhud and Ahzab were very necessary. And even the conquest of Mecca, like it had to be done if you had to survive. You can't just let them keep on attacking you. So in the seerah of the Prophet, we can say that very clearly most of the battles were necessary and were defensive to gain the rights of the Muslims back. However, it is also true to say that not all such battles can easily be put into this category. Some battles, especially some saraya, and remember saraya was the expeditions the Prophet did not participate in, he sent others out. Many of the saraya, especially in 9th and 10th Islam, there was no dire need, there's no threat at all. Going to the fringes of Oman, for example, right? Going to the other side of Bahrain, for example, it's not as if there was an immediate threat in some of those saraya. And especially we talked about the Battle of Tabuk. The Battle of Tabuk remains a big question mark amongst seerah specialists. Why? Why was one of the largest armies ever sent up north? For what? And in reality, it seems one of the strongest reasons is to show the powers up north that Muslims meant business and that they are going to attack, which is why Abu Bakr as-Siddiq took the initiative to attack. Followed the same route when he went to attack Sham. Same route of Tabuk, and he went from Tabuk onwards. So the process was basically setting the precedent for them. Now, whatever is the case about the time of the Prophet, there is simply no denying that the Khulafa al-Rashidun and the Umayyads engaged in offensive conquest of other lands. The Sassanid Empire did not pose any immediate threat. They were not attacking the Muslims at all. In fact, as we will study, when the Muslims attacked the Sassanid Empire, Rustum said, "What are you guys doing here? Why are you attacking us? We're not bothering you. What are you doing over here?" Remember, that was the famous, we'll get to that conversation today and next time as well. And the Romans as well couldn't care less about the Arabs. Remember, we said this from the very beginning. Both the Romans and the Persians, or I should say the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire, that's the more precise term, they were minding their own business, fighting each other. And they were not fighting the Arabs at the time because they didn't see any strategic advantage in controlling the Arabs. The Arabs were not a civilization that offered anything to them, and they didn't care about oil back then, right? Unlike now. So there was no reason for them to invade. If they had wanted to invade, there could have been no stopping them before the coming of Islam. But there was no reason for them. Now that Islam has conquered and is solidified, there was still no immediate reason for them to invade. There's no threat at all. And yet Abu Bakr as-Siddiq sent armies of tens of thousands of people. And Umar ibn al-Khattab followed suit. And the same goes when Umar ibn al-Khattab sent Amr ibn al-As into Egypt. Egypt was not sending any army into Arabia. And Amr ibn al-As with 4,000 people said, give me 4,000 people, I will give you Alexandria, which was the capital of that region. I'll give you Alexandria. Why? What was Alexandria doing to the Muslims? Nothing. So the claim that, oh, all of this is a defensive battle, frankly, it's not proven by anything. And it goes against common sense. Why would you send tens of thousands of people when there's no threat at all? And the fact of the matter, therefore, there is simply no denying this. And the same goes, by the way, even for our lands of India, of Sindh, Makran. Why would okay, it's true that a pirate or a small mini lord basically irritated some of the Muslim, traders, there's no doubt. But you don't send an army to attack because of a trade dispute. Think about it. You don't send an entire naval expedition to conquer land, which is what happened in Sindh. They conquered land, and they established, the Umayyads established an extension of the Umayyad dynasty over there. And that was the beginning of Multan. Multan was the earliest Islamic land. Makran and Multan, these areas were the earliest Islamic lands. From the time of the Sahaba, some of the Sahaba were alive at this time when Multan was conquered. What for? You're going to establish a mini dynasty over there? For what? So clearly, there's not just a defensive jihad going on here. There's no denying that the early Muslims wanted political conquest. Now, is that problematic? Should we try to explain it away? All we need to do is contextualize. All we need to do is contextualize. Contextualize. Firstly, everyone did it, without exception. Every superpower at the time was attacking every other power. That's how those powers survived. It was the law of the time. In fact, it was the law up until medieval Europe, where look at France and England, for example. I mean, if you ever study their history, all you do is memorize one battle after another, after another, after another. Keep on, they're fighting each other up until modern times. Now they're fighting over culture and cuisine and language and whatnot. Still, physical conflict, military conflict was a part of life. And there were regions of the world that switched hands literally dozens of times between competing powers. Damascus is one example. One era it's under the Persians, then it's under the Romans, then it's under the Persians, under the Romans. And the border between the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine Empire was never established. They're always fighting one another. And Damascus is kind of in the middle. So you had times when the Persians controlled Damascus. Then you had times, most of the time, Romans controlled Damascus. And the same goes for so many other small cities as well. So this was a time frame where everybody is attacking everybody. It's a fact of life. Why should the Muslims be any different? As well, there's no denying that of the goals of early Islam was indeed to spread the political power of Islam. In fact, is not that the goal of every civilization? Why were the Romans fighting everybody else? Why did Alexander in ancient times go and conquer everybody else? That's how civilizations flourished. There's nothing strange about early Islam doing the same. And in our times, by the way, perhaps it is true that the major superpowers technically don't want to, or I shouldn't put it that way, they technically give the impression they're not invading other lands and countries without provocation. But okay, suppose ignore all of the military conflict. Doesn't every nation in our time strive its best to get the most political clout and economic clout and military might than other nations? This is what nations do. This is exactly what every civilization does. And in our times, they might use other tactics, many of which are unethical. The IMF, for example, right? The superpowers of our times, they use the International Monetary Fund, for example, or they'll use the United Nations. But in essence, In essence, each country and civilization strives to get the most power for itself, including the one we're living, especially the one we're living in. This is a fact of life that is historically undeniable. So why should we sugarcoat for our own tradition as well? Yes, early Islam wanted political dominion, and guess what? They got it. They got it. They put their eyes on the prize, and they indeed got it. A third reason we will mention here, and this gets a little controversial, is the issue of conversion. Conversion. Did these early Muslims want to convert the people that they're conquering? Give me an honest response. What do you guys think? So they would not want them to convert. Where are you from, Akhi, ethnically? You are from Misr. What were your ancestors? Before, when Islam came, what were they? Copts. So when the Sahaba entered your land, you think they wanted your ancestors to remain Copts? That wasn't my question. That was not my question. My question was, and this is why I'm being a little bit pressing here, because I need the correct answer. Because we're living at a time and place where giving these politically correct answers is politically incorrect. We have to be frank and firm, and when we do so, we will actually be able to win arguments. Did the Sahaba want their conquered peoples to convert? That's not answering the question. Did they want them to convert? Sure, exactly. Jazakallah khair. That's the point. Did they want them to convert? Sure they did. Was that a motivational factor? Yeah, jazakallahu khairan. That's what I wanted to hear. This is the reality. If it wasn't a motivational factor, my ancestors worshipped cows. I would still be worshipping cows if they hadn't come. Your ancestors worshipped a cross. And if it weren't for the blessings of Allah through these conquests, probably you would also be worshipping a cross now. Do we understand this? We should stop sugarcoating. That's the reality. They came not just for political power, yes for political power, yes for economic power, but as well they did want the people to convert. Now we get to the second question, which is what you're trying to get at, right? But I want to get the difficult out of the way. Did they force people to convert? That question we can alhamdulillah say without being apologetic, because that is a fact. No, they didn't force people to convert. They did not force people to convert, and in fact they knew that it was not a part of their religion to force people to convert. It is because they did not force people to convert that to this day the lands that were under the Mughal Empire, majority of them are still Hindu. The lands that were under the Muslims of Egypt, when the Muslims entered Egypt, literally 99.999999% were Coptic Christians, right? This is a documented historical fact that has been, lots of research has been done on this by looking at the registrars of names, Christian names versus Muslim names. And plenty of research has been done, and we notice and we find that in Egypt, for example, over the course of the last, especially the first 12 centuries of conquering, not the last 200 years, not since the British came. When the British came, colonialization, that changed everything. But up until the era of Napoleon, when did Napoleon enter Egypt? 1798. 1798 he entered Egypt. Up until the era of colonization, which is relatively recent, 1798 is after America was founded. Okay, that's when colonialism begins with Napoleon invading Egypt. This is the beginning of European colonization of Islamic lands. Up until that point in time, the conversion rate from Coptic Christianity to Islam never spiked at one time from 0 to 100. Rather, we see from the conquest of Islam up until Napoleon, slowly the numbers just continue to increase until they kind of peter out at 90%, which is what Egypt is now. 90% Muslim, 10% Coptic. To this day, Egypt, which was 100% Coptic, 1 out of every 10 Egyptians is still a Coptic. Why? Because there really was freedom of religion. There really was not the types of freedom that exist in the modern West. There's no doubt about it. Let's not again sugarcoat. Not the types of freedoms, but there was the freedom to be a Coptic Christian, to worship, to practice the laws of Coptic Christianity, to do the rituals, to pass it down to your children, you could remain Coptic. And that therefore, 1 out of every 10 Egyptians to this day remain Coptic. Okay? So, never in the history of Islam, and this is not being apologetic, this is the truth, was a sword waved in the face of somebody and he was told, convert or die. That didn't happen. But did the Sahaba and the early Muslims desire their subjects to convert? Wallahi they did. Of course they did. Wouldn't you desire other people to convert? Now you're ruling them, wouldn't you give them incentives to convert? That's what the Sharia does, by the way. That's what the Sharia does. The Sharia gives you incentives. If you don't convert, you have to pay extra tax. You have certain restrictions. You have this, you have that. But you're allowed to live your life according to your faith. So, one of the goals of invading these lands was indeed to convert the people, but not by force. How so then? Multiple ways. First and foremost, simply by interacting with the Muslims. Now, if Islam is the truth, and we all believe it is the truth, yet the bulk of humanity, suppose there's no internet, pre-social media, let's go back 100 years. So the tribes of Africa, the jungles of Tibet and whatnot, how are these people going to be exposed to Islam? By interaction. And what better way of interaction than the civilization of Islam trickles out and spreads, which is what early Islam did. And what better way to see the reality of Islam than to see the fruits of an Islamic civilization? You live under an Islamic civilization. You see what it can offer you. You see its dominance. You see its heritage. You compare it with the people before and the people you think might come afterwards. And then guess what? You're like, man, this makes a lot of sense. I like it. I want to convert. And that is why my ancestors and your ancestors converted. Nobody put a sword on their throats. They, at some point in my history and your history, somebody, well, I know it's my great-great-grandfather, I know exactly, I don't know about you if you know or not, but I know exactly how many generations ago, somebody was a Hindu and they converted to Islam. They decided of their own free will. Nobody forced them to do that. Interacting with the Muslims of India, living under the Nawabs of Lucknow, they realized, oh, you know what, this is a good religion, I want to embrace it. Your ancestors as well. How would that have happened unless the Sahaba and Tabi'un and the Umayyads invaded these lands and allowed Islam to flourish so that people could see this is Islam? Correct? So let's not sugarcoat it. One of the reasons of invasion was indeed conversion, by seeing the lived experiences, and yes, and I've said this before as well, by even offering incentives. Because when you're so sure that something is good, you know, people do this all the time to their products. When they're selling their products, right? They'll give you an incentive to buy it. Because they know that their product is so good, once you're used to it and you like it, khalas, you're going to keep on getting more. So, if we as Muslims believe this, why are we surprised then that the Sharia is so confident that people will accept it, that it gives them perks and incentives, which it does. It does give perks and incentives for you to accept the faith. Because it knows, once you do so for whatever reason, suppose you do it out of greed, you want more money, so your taxes are lifted, because they will be lifted, right? If you, again, I don't sugarcoat. If you were a non-Muslim, you had to pay jizya in the Khilafah, in the Abbasid times and whatnot. Somebody who's greedy and said, you know what, I don't want to pay this jizya, I'm just going to convert because I want more money in my pocket. What's going to happen? In time, if not him, then who? The children, for sure. Which is exactly what happened. Correct? Which is exactly what happened. That in time, and we see this all the time, I've given this example many times, converts, we see them to this day. Many times, number one reason people convert now is not because of money. We don't got any money to offer you that. But it's what? It's love. It's love. It's like they fall in love and they want to get married. Okay? So they convert because of love. Then what happens? Usually they become more Islamic than the real spouse. And then the spouse comes running, I don't know what happened to my wife, man, she's fanatic, would not do something. He's like, alhamdulillah, okay, this is what happens. Okay? That's the reality of... So what has just happened over here? Truth has won over. Truth has won over. We're so confident in the truth of Islam Yalla, go ahead. You want to be greedy for the money? Okay, here's your incentive. But we know eventually it's gonna come inside of you. So, yes, it is true that one of the reasons for invasion was also conversion, but not direct, indirect. And by the way, this is also a fact that needs to be mentioned. There were khulafa and there were dynasties that discouraged conversion. And some of the Umayyad khulafa made conversion very difficult, which is one of the reasons why the Abbasid revolution took place. Because there was discrimination. They didn't want you to convert. Why would they not want you to convert? Taxes. Taxes. They wanted more taxes. And so they put hurdles in conversion. And that's one of the reasons why the Mawali are the non-Arab converts. They joined the Banu Hashemite revolt, the Alawi revolt against the Umayyads. Okay, so this is another reason. And then one final point that we'll mention here, we have the explicit testimony of one of the Sahaba, Rib'i ibn Amir, when he stood in front of Rustum, the general governor of the Sassanid Empire. The primary general. He wasn't the Khalifa, he wasn't the ruler, he was the general, the primary general, the military genius of the Sassanid Empire. And we'll talk about him next week a little bit as well. When Rib'i ibn Amir was standing in front of Rustum, in the palace of Rustum, in that luxurious palace, the ruins of which still stand to this day, at Ctesiphon, to this day they stand, those massive beautiful pillars and whatnot, one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. You know, the Persians would build massive structures. And Rib'i is asked by Rustum, why are you invading us? What are you doing here? Go back to your lands. What are you doing here? And Rib'i said what? That famous line, you should all memorize that famous line, that Rib'i said that Allah has sent us لِنُخْرِجَ الْعِبَادِ مِنْ عِبَادَةِ الْعِبَادِ إِلَى عِبَادَةِ رَبِّ الْعِبَادِ. Allah has sent us so that we take mankind from worshipping others of mankind to worshipping the Lord of mankind. وَمِن جَوْرِ الْأَدْيَانِ إِلَىٰ عَدْلِ الْإِسْلَامِ. And from the tyranny of all false religions to the justice and truth of Islam. وَمِن ضِيقِ الدُّنْيَا إِلَىٰ سَعَةِ الْآخِرَةِ. And from the confines of this world to the beauty of the next. Now, Rib'i's motivation is what? Spreading Islam. Da'wah. How can you deny this? It's in his testimony, standing in front of the Persian general. Why have you come here? We have come لِنُخْرِجَ الْعِبَادِ مِنْ عِبَادَةِ الْعِبَادِ إِلَىٰ عِبَادَةِ رَبِّ الْعِبَادِ. Memorize this, simple. The Sahaba themselves are telling you their motivation. It wasn't money. Yes, the Umayyads and some of them, the prime motivation was economic, but there's nothing wrong with that. Civilizations need that as well. The Sahaba, their primary motivation was what? They understood this is the way to spread Islam. Not by waving the sword in front of the necks of people, but by showing Islam as a civilization. By ruling as a dominant military and political force, the people see this is Islam and then they choose to embrace it, which is exactly what happened in the history of humanity, in the history of the Ummah. All of us, look, we have people from Africa, from India, Pakistan, from Egypt, from Timbuktu, from where, how? All of our ancestors had other faiths. All of us. Where did this Islam come from? It's because Islam spread as a dominant political force. This is offensive. This is not defensive. This is offensive. And we thank Allah for that offensive. We thank Allah for that, and that is why Islam spread the way that it is. Now, the final point here, and by the way, so this whole point of spreading what you think is the truth, why are we so embarrassed about this when this is exactly what our own country and every other military superpower in our world does today? They go fighting for what? Oil? Okay, well, for oil, yes, but what do they say they fight for? Democracy. Sah wala la, right? Human rights. For the right of women to not wear the burqa, we're going to go invade Afghanistan. I mean, literally, that's what they said, right? To make women, liberate women, so that they don't have to wear the burqa. Now, they're so confident in their values, they're willing to go to war, and they proudly boast. We're invading to spread democracy. We're going to bomb democracy into them. We're going to show them what human rights is by our 20-ton bombs. Okay, khalas. By throwing tons of bombs, you're going to show them human rights. But they're confident enough to say this. And their people swallow it up. That yes, this is why we're going. So why should we be embarrassed that our classical heritage, we're not talking about modern times, we're talking about the Khulafa ar-Rashidun and the Umayyads, our classical heritage, they as well felt this much confidence, if not more so. We have the truth and we're spreading the truth. Sah? This is what happens, right? Now, here is where the big question comes. And that is, does this mean that we have to resurrect that understanding? That's why a lot of Muslims now, especially in light of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of these weird groups, that's why a lot of Muslims now, they're like worried to even say what I just said. Because it's very easy to take snippets of what I just said, which is what Fox News will do anyway, and put it online and say, oh, radical preacher and whatnot. That's understandable. It's understandable, okay? Which is why we also have to make a very simple and clear disclaimer. We're talking about the past. And we're talking about the Khulafa ar-Rashidun and the Umayyads and the spread of Islam in the 7th century. Do we have to resurrect those ideas in our times and follow some of those same notions? Well, ISIS thinks so. But what percentage does ISIS represent of the Ummah? Where are the rest of the ulama of our Ummah? As we all know, the bulk of the ulama, the vast majority, in fact, the ulama, period, because ISIS does not have ulama, Qaeda does not have ulama. Pretty much all ulama of all stripes, from Deobandis to Ikhwan to Azharis to Salafi, the bulk of the ummah basically, they all understand that we're living in different times. That there's now a United Nations, there's peace treaties, there's borders. There were no borders in medieval Christianity. Forget medieval Islam. There were no borders in Europe up until, the Treaty of Westphalian was a 16, you should know this, 16, where's your daughter? Ask her, the history expert. 16 something, Treaty of Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia is when nation states were born. This is before this time. There were no borders, no boundaries. Look again at France and England, always attacking one another. World War I is what codified some boundaries. And then even then, and we're constantly redrawing the map. Before 1700s, there were no border states. So things have changed. And pretty much everybody, that's anybody, says nowadays the concept of offensive jihad does not make sense. Nowadays, we don't have to now resurrect this thing. There's no need to do this. And this is the fatwa of Shaykh Qadhi, his latest book, and in all likelihood his last one is already, 85 years old. May Allah give him a long life. But Shaykh Qadhi's latest book, magnificent, huge volumes, the fiqh of jihad is called, fiqh al-jihad. And he wrote it in a post-9/11 world. He wrote it because of all of these groups, Al-Qaeda and whatnot. This is before ISIS came along. And it was a refutation of this. So his book, thick volumes, fiqh al-jihad. In it are sections about the United Nations, are sections about borders. And he basically says what all the ulama are saying, that in our times, with these treaties, with these international boundaries, it is actually in everybody's interest that peace reigns in the world. We shouldn't be attacking and fighting and doing offensive jihad. And he goes, these days, the jihad now is not of the sword, it is of the pen and the intellect and the mind and social media and whatnot. So this is mainstream Sunni fiqh. Therefore, what we have said about Islamic history, there's no need to sugarcoat it. It is as it is, and we thank Allah that that's what happened. But we do not have to resurrect it in our times. We do not have to bring back on offensive jihad. And offensive jihad has many conditions. The first of them is a legitimate khilafah. That's the first condition. Then you have many others. And we all know that really there is no legitimate khilafah in our times. So the bottom line, there is no need for us to be apologetic, to try to sugarcoat the past. Yes, indeed, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu intended to wage war against the Sassanids and the Byzantine Empire because he wanted to spread Islamic laws, civilizations, values, and yes, the religion. And he succeeded in doing that. And that was the beginning of much bigger success to happen. And inshallah, with that we will stop for today.